President William Ruto acquiescing to the protests that have killed about 23 young people in the nation. He has declined to sign the finance bill, sent it back to Parliament. There is a big demonstration, about a 1 million-person march that is set to take place later today. Here is the President's conceding.
On the continuing conversation around the content of the Finance Bill 2024, and listening keenly to the people of Kenya who have said loudly that they want nothing to do with this Finance Bill 2024, I concede, and therefore I will not sign the 2024 Finance Bill.
All right, what about the fiscal situation? The International Monetary Fund, they have said they've been monitoring what's been going on. Here is a quote from their Director of Communications saying the IMF is closely monitoring the situation in Kenya. Our main goal is supporting Kenya and to help it overcome the difficult economic challenges it faces and improve its economic prospects and the well-being of its people. That's Julie Kozak, IMF Director of Communications. We're happy to head to Johannesburg, where we're joined by Yvonne Mhango, Africa Economist at Bloomberg, for the latest analysis on this. Yvonne, good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. So starting off with Kenya, President Ruto, as he just said, has to listen to the people. But, you know, what about the IMF, Yvonne, and that extra funding from the last staff meeting that they were trying to unlock? What does this mean going forward for the fiscal situation for Kenya?
All right, great. So yes, we've seen the withdrawal of the finance bill following the protests against the hikes by Kenyans. I guess they have to go back to the drawing board. But I think most importantly, what I should state is that fiscal reform still needs to progress. And now the question is what Ruto's administration does in order to bring down the budget deficit. So as we can see, they were trying to raise revenue by tax increases, and there's been significant resistance and rejection of that. Now they're going to have to focus hard on what they can do to cut down spending, because that's the alternative. The third option, of course, is to increase borrowing, but that option is quite constrained given that international or US interest rates in particular remain high. Domestic liquidity in Kenya is also a challenge as well. So they're going to have to return to the drawing board and explore more of their options.
Thank you. I think so. You preempted my next question. So he talked about austerity measures. So basically, spending cuts are not enough to get them where they need to get to.
Well, revenue increases is what I think the population is saying is not enough. The electorate is saying that they need to go back and review particularly spending by government officials. And that's the austerity measures, I think Ruto implies austerity among the government officials themselves. So cutting down on travel, cutting down on hotel expenses, entertainment, that sort of thing.
Can it be said, Yvonne, that the fiscal challenges being faced in emerging markets, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, are there still lingering effects from the borrowing and spending from the COVID pandemic? Is that still lingering?
Yes, so they're related. So post-COVID, we saw several African countries embark on fiscal consolidation programs. They needed to, because during the pandemic, of course, if you recall, there was a significant increase in spending and debt positions ballooned. And that had to come down in order to prevent unsustainable debt positions like we eventually saw in Ghana and Zambia. So Kenya is not alone in going down this path of fiscal consolidation. In addition, we've seen the cost of living increase quite sharply. That's on the back of currencies depreciating significantly. And in Kenya's case, the currency lost half its value between 2002 and 2023. That, of course, fed into inflation. We saw the transport or the fuel subsidy being removed. And as a result, transport costs increased substantially. And then, of course, interest rates increased quite sharply, impacting those that had debt. So the cost of living is part of the reason why you're seeing people on the street. They're saying the burden of high interest rates, high inflation, and the rise in tax burden is just too much.
Moving over to South Africa, where you are over in Johannesburg, we've heard the ANC's first deputy secretary talking pretty tough. Can a unity government realistically be formed without the Democratic Alliance?
So technically, yes, they could seek other partners. As you recall, ANC got 40% of the vote. You do have other parties that got up to 15% of the vote. But at this stage, the market-friendly outcome is a coalition that includes the Democratic Alliance. So while there are teething problems and negotiations are ongoing, at the end of the day, I think the ANC does recognize that will be the most favorable outcome to keep the DA within the coalition. But as I've mentioned, they do have other options if need be.
Now, the markets do seem to want the involvement of the Democratic Alliance, I guess, because of their policies. Is that accurate?
Well, they seem to have a firmer hand on fiscal restraint. So there's a view that if they came into power, would see debt stabilization happen sooner. So similar to Kenya and other countries, South Africa is also trying to stabilize its debt, and the DA is considered to be a good ally. Also, in terms of the other implementation simply of policy itself. And I think the example that's often given is the Western Cape, which is the province where Cape Town is situated and is considered to be well run. So I think many South Africans believe that if you have the Democratic Alliance in government, similarly as they're governing the Western Cape, would see better service delivery.
Now, the other parties, the EFF, MK, and so on, with the different ideologies, I guess, have to be involved. So what's your, I guess, future outlook for fiscal policy in South Africa with all these different parties and different ideologies?
So first, I should mention the EFF and MK at this point have formed what they call a progressive caucus, and they'll be part of the opposition. So they're not part of the coalition at all for various reasons. But with regards to fiscal policy, that should not change. Policy in general should not change going forward. Most parties in South Africa are aligned when it comes to policies. Maybe their priorities differ, but policy itself, I think they're aligned in terms of what needs to be done. If anything, on the fiscal front, what the anticipation is that we'll see debt peak sooner rather than later and start to see debt falling before the end of this decade. So that's the anticipation. We expect the Treasury to continue to pursue a smaller budget deficit and lower the debt to GDP ratio.
All right, fantastic. Thank you for that outlook for South Africa. I guess going back to Kenya, what's your outlook for how the rest of this year could turn out? I guess, does it all hinge on what happens with negotiations going forward? How do you think Kenya works things out over the next few months as we close out the year?
So what we anticipate is that they will go through and review the current finance bill. What we expect is that they may take away some of the tax increase measures that they proposed and introduce more spending cuts than we saw in the initial budget. So that's our anticipation. But the ultimate goal is still to bring down the budget deficit. It might not be to the 3.3% target that they were hoping for, but ultimately the direction remains the same, which is a smaller budget deficit.
All right, now, Yvonne, so I guess overall, just looking at the continent, emerging markets in general, are these major headwinds still inflation and debts? Is that it? I was just taking a macro view continent-wide.
So if we look at the continent, yes, we are still struggling to tame inflation. That's an issue. Several countries still have double-digit inflation, and we're not seeing rate cuts as we're seeing in other parts of the world. So that remains a concern and something that we hope changes going into 2025.
Yvonne Mhango, Africa economist at Bloomberg. Always a pleasure getting your insights on what's going on the continent. We thank you so much for talking to us about the latest developments from Kenya and also South Africa.